Welcome to the final session in the 2022 SUBStrong Reading Between the Lines Contract Study Track. Be reminded that this series continues through 2022 as monthly virtual presentations. You can find the information and registration at asacolorado.com. I encourage you to continue your study of the construction subcontract and work toward earning your certificate of attendance and proving you are a champion of the construction subcontract. I am Mark Cohn. I work for Delta Drywall. Some of our past projects include Coors Field, DU Law School, Google's Boulder campus, and lots of schools, offices, medical, and retail buildings all over Colorado. Design risk is managed throughout any project. We are wrapping up the 2022 SUBStrong Contract Study Series with a continuing discussion on design risk with a focus on express delegations. Unlike in the prior session where we explored a general contractor or owner disclaiming its design responsibilities, this session looks at the affirmative contract language that gives the subcontractor design risk and responsibility. Typically, these design responsibility clauses are referred to as design delegation or design assist and are seen in design build context. Understanding when a subcontractor has design responsibility, the degree of that responsibility, and how to avoid unwanted design responsibility will be the focus of this session. I would like to introduce you to Sarah Mielke, attorney with Woods Aitken. Sarah joined Woods Aitken in 2021 after clerking with the firm for 2 years. She is a member of the firm's litigation group, collaborating with clients in the commercial, construction, labor, and employment practice areas. Sarah, thank you for your time and sharing your expertise with us this afternoon. Take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and get a PowerPoint up here. All right. So, yes, we're going to be discussing design risk and express delegations today. It can be a little bit dense, so hang with me. We'll try and make it as applicable to everyday situations as possible. Before we dive in, I do want to note that given that the audience is going to be subcontractors, I've actually taken some time to research the way that engineers are looking to offload responsibility as a way of kind of helping us be on the lookout for ways that responsibility is going to get placed onto us. So just again, hang with me, and I promise I'll tie all this up as we go. So first off, a couple of the things that we're going to look at today. Delegations. What are they? Who's involved? When do they happen? Where can you find them? And how do they happen? We have to cover some of those basics before we can really understand the limits on design delegation, the pros and cons of design delegation, the risks associated with it, and what I have dubbed the 3 C's of risk mitigation when it comes to design delegation. So first, what is a delegation? It's interesting. There's actually no agreed upon definition in the construction industry. A lot of academics have taken a stab at trying to wrap this all up and make it all sound pretty. The reality is different trades and different professions view design delegation differently. So that does make it a lot more difficult when you're trying to understand how liability can come of it. So even though there is no agreed upon definition, most people would agree that design delegation is a form of collaboration between a design professional and a contractor, where the contractor assumes responsibility for an element or a portion of the design. And this actually comes from the AIA and the AISC, which is the most recent widespread guidance on this issue. It's a white paper that they put out. If you're looking for more in-depth discussion of design delegation, I would highly encourage you to take a look at that white paper in the future. So design delegation, even though it's still being discussed and teased apart and talked about like it's a brand new thing, has actually been in the construction industry for decades. For a long time, contractors have been assuming responsibility for elements of design. And in the past, it just hasn't really happened formally. There hasn't been a contract provision that specifically places that responsibility on a contractor. They just do it. In 1997, the AIA 201 general conditions started to formalize what we now know to be design delegation. And this has actually led to, what we're seeing as bubbling up of liability that's trying to get shifted around among construction players. So design delegation, I personally think, can be best understood on this kind of continuum of contractor involvement in the design process. And we're starting with the least amount of involvement or liability, which the two kind of coincide, and moving down the line, more liability comes. So starting with informal involvement. This is just an informal exchange of information between a design professional and a contractor. There's no agreement, there's no compensation, and there is no design liability with informal involvement. So bringing this to every day, what this might look like is a design professional maybe is working on some specs and has a question about a design element. Rather than go ahead and delegate that at the very beginning or later on, the design professional just calls up the contractor or subcontractor and asks maybe questions about constructability. Not every situation is going to look like that, but it gives you a general flavor of what informal involvement is. Casual discussions, no contract, no liability. Then we move to design assist. So I mentioned that there's no formal definition of design delegation. Design assist has this problem, but tenfold. I mean, nobody can agree, even within the same trade, the same industry, there are heavy disagreements about what design assist is. In general, though, again, there are some agreed upon elements. Namely, the contractor provides information to assist in design development. So informal involvement maybe clears up some questions about constructability, things like that. Design assist is actually helping with the design development. The contractor may incur contractual liability for information that it provides, but the designer really maintains ultimate responsibility. A lot of people disagree on that, and they would say the designer passes off responsibility. Again, just the most widely accepted understanding is that the designer maintains responsibility. With design delegation, the contractor, we're out of the gray, we're out of no liability. With design delegation, the contractor does assume contractual liability for an element of the design. They may incur both contractual and professional design liability. We're going to talk about that later on, but that's a whole can of worms with liability that could actually have a presentation all of its own, which I guess it kind of does. We're there right now. Just know that the professional design liability aspect is going to be a very big deal. So design delegation primarily shows up on on design build projects, That's the most common delivery system where you see design delegation. It's also the system that kind of lends itself to a hotbed of conflicts from design delegation because things are always in flux, which means responsibilities kind of need to pivot and change as the project develops. However, design delegation shows up on all kinds of projects. Public projects, private projects, you'll see it a lot with projects that involve complex systems or have one or two very complex elements or more. And different elements of that design can be delegated throughout the project. Okay, so who is involved in design delegation? You have contractors, design professionals, and owners. The owner is going to contract separately with the contractors and the design professionals. And when I say contractor, contractor or subcontractor, whichever contractor the design is getting delegated to. The design professional in that second category there is really in reference to the owner's design professional. As we're going to discuss, a lot of times the contractor has to bring on their own professional for design delegation to really help perform those professional services. But what you'll see is the owner has a contract with their own design professional and then a contract with the contractor. The contractor or subcontractor, known as design builder, will assume responsibility for the elements of the design that are delegated to it. The design builder may need to, like I said, acquire their own architect or engineer to perform the professional services involved in that element of delegated design. They may assume responsibility for portions of the design. The type of responsibility they assume is going to differ from case to case. So then we have the design professionals. They will provide performance criteria that the contractor typically uses to develop the design. It doesn't always work that way. And I think that's something that could probably be said for every single slide here, is that design delegation looks very different on a case-by-case basis. But in general, the performance specs are going to guide the contractor's development of design. The design professional, in that regard, may actually still hold on to some responsibility for elements of design, even if they're delegated. As I mentioned, the owner contracts separately with both the designer and the contractor. And then the owner, which I'm pretty sure this was discussed in different contract presentations, the whole spear and doctrine issue, the owner is technically responsible to provide the contractor with all performance and design specifications that are reliable. That is, again, an issue in and of itself. Just know that that is kind of the role that the owner plays in design delegation. So next, when does design delegation happen? So design delegation can happen at any time, but according to that most recent guidance from the AIA and the AISC, design delegation is more likely to happen later in the project. This is compared to design assist and informal involvement. Design assist typically happens earlier when the specifications are being developed, and informal involvement, I guess, could really happen at any time. But the whole idea with design delegation is that in most situations, you're going to be relying on performance specifications. To rely on those specifications, they would have had to have already been developed. And so typically that's when you'll see design delegation pop up. However, I would be doing a disservice if I did not note that you should be on the lookout for design delegation as early as your invitation to bid. So even though design delegation typically happens post specification development, you need to watch out for this stuff early on. If it's going to happen in an invitation to bid or something around that very early project conception time, you want to look for whether the bid includes design as part of the scope of work. That should tip you off right there that this might be a design delegation. Does the bid place design responsibility directly on subcontractors? Does the proposed contract include design responsibility at all? Are the designs complete or are they still being developed? In a design build project, we know the answer to that one almost always, the designs are going to be incomplete. That alone is not necessarily enough to give a design delegation legs, but coupled with one of these other factors, it definitely could be. So again, just something to be on the lookout. So where does the design delegation happen? Again, typically in the performance specs, you can usually find these in the project agreement. Those performance specs, depending on how they're written out for each project and developed for each project, can kind of guide the scope of the design that's being delegated depending on the specifications you're working off of. But definitely look for design delegation in the subcontract and in the prime contract. Contract is the best way to make sure that your design delegation is not imposing indirect liability. We're going to talk about that at length in a little bit, but just be aware that even though the best way to do this is by contract, it can happen kind of implicitly too. As I mentioned, watch out for the prime contract. AIA A410 allows design delegation provisions to flow down. So even if the design delegation is not in your subcontract, if it's in the prime contract and somehow flows down to you, it could still be valid. Okay, so how do delegations happen? As I mentioned, sometimes it's not always as clear as this is in my subcontract. I'm expressly being told that the design is being delegated to me. That would be a dream, right? But that's not always the case. Implied delegations, one way that they can happen is by a disclaimer. Again, I think disclaimers were discussed in some other contract presentations. For design delegation purposes, just be aware that if the owner disclaims responsibility for some part of the design, that, kind of by way of negative implication, I guess you could say, that responsibility may fall to the contractor. A heavy way that this happens is design defect discovery. If those are disclaimed, somebody has to be responsible for it. The main thing to note, even though in a situation like this, it won't always be black and white. So even though the owner won't always implicitly impose design liability on a contractor or subcontractor, it can happen. And that's the big thing with design delegation. You need to be aware of what could go wrong in the situation. So, because that's where liability comes from. So if the owner is disclaiming liability for something, then that bit is up in the air. It's completely up in the air. It could be anyone's responsibility, which means that it could be tied to a contractor or subcontractor. So that's the thing to worry about with implied delegations. As I noted, contracts are the best way, and it's not foolproof, as you'll see. Contracts, though, are the best way to delegate aspects of the design. If you're looking for standard forms, the AIA Section 312.10.1 of A201 has some language in there, and the Consensus Docs 200.315 also has some language. Specifically, the Consensus Docs states that the owner is responsible to specify required performance and design criteria. The contractor is not responsible for the adequacy of the specifications. The contractor must procure professional services as required by law, and the signature and seal of the design professional is required on all submissions, essentially. So very similar in the AIA. The only difference that you'll see if you read the two side by side is that the owner and the owner's architect are both expressly made responsible for performance and design criteria in the AIA. This same thing can be true here in the Consensus Docs. It's just not stated directly. This has very little implications on the contractor, though, because either way, the contractor is not responsible. But again, you have to procure professional services as required by law. The signature and seal is going to be required for from a design professional on all submissions. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that one way to kind of be a step ahead and look for liability coming is to look for where it's going to come from. That's going to be typically coming from a design professional. So it's kind of like a little recon, if you will, to go on and look at different engineering organizations and see what are they saying? What responsibility are they trying to offload, and how could that come to you? So one thing that's helpful to see is this example for precast concrete structures. This just lays out the process. So we're not quite into total liability territory yet, but just from an engineer's perspective, you can kind of see, how this happens. The engineer delegates the design of the precast structural system or structural elements. So it doesn't have to be the full system. It could just be an element of a system. And delegates that to a contractor. The submittals of the design, from the contractor, have to then get approved by the engineer and the architect and the general contractor. So this kind of lays out the process in terms of what's the engineer's responsibility to review the design. Who does the delegating? The engineer. So then what are our limits on design delegation? The main limit, and the most important one, the one that we're going to focus on, is the performance of professional services. I mentioned this a couple times in both the Consensus Docs here and the AIA. The contractor cannot perform professional services and needs to hire a design professional to perform those services as required by state law. And again, referencing the most recent guidance on this from the AIA and the AISC, they talk a lot about this too, about when to bring in a design professional. And the AIA and the Consensus Docs both recognize that there are times that the contractor simply cannot legally anyway, perform elements of the design that are delegated to it. And so sample language from AIA, the contractor shall not be required to provide professional services in violation of applicable law. So while the AIA and the Consensus Docs are great in that they kind of help you formulate a design delegation contract, they're dependent on state law in most cases, unless that's going to be modified. But what this really should tip you off to is that you have to be aware of your jurisdiction's licensing and state licensing requirements. Because regardless of what your document says, your contract document says, if the applicable jurisdiction's law does not allow you to perform a certain service, you can't do it. Or you can, but you're at great risk of liability. So moving on to state statutes that the AIA and the consensus docs both reference. Each jurisdiction is going to have its own licensing statute. Some state laws will permit contractors to perform services that are ancillary to professional design services. That can include things like, curtain walls, precast concrete panels, proprietary exterior wall systems, handrail and guardrail systems, attachments, and I'm pulling these from actual contracts where these items may have been delegated, exhaust systems, sprinkler systems. So anything with a kind of maybe complex system that involves some kind of proprietary installer information, be on the lookout for design delegation, because some states will allow contractors to perform those services without any kind of professional service license. They don't have to be an engineer or an architect. The tough thing with that is you run into a huge gray area. Where does your ancillary service start and where does the professional service start? And where does each one stop relative to each other? That's where litigation comes from. And you'll see that the states that permit that are actually not the majority. Some states will just permit delegation of certain elements of the design from one design professional to another without regard for ancillary services. Most states are behind the ball altogether, and they won't address design delegation directly. Instead, they will just actually kind of tell you what a professional service is. So then it's left up to the contracting parties to determine, are we asking this contractor to perform a professional service, and what does that mean? And as you can see from Colorado, so this is Colorado's engineer statute, from their engineer licensing statute. They have licensing statutes for various professions. Engineering can be found in the same chapter as land surveying and architecture. From the engineering statute, you'll see that practice of engineering by law means performance for others of any professional service, creative work, blah, blah, blah. And then there are some specific references that I left out because they're very long that tie these services directly to engineering. But the statute also notes that this includes consultation, investigation, evaluation, planning, design, and the observation of construction to evaluate compliance with plans and specifications. So remember I talked about earlier about when an owner might disclaim responsibility for an aspect of the design. Very common, you're going to see that happen with discovery of defects. That responsibility could fall to the contractor. So now you have contractual responsibility, right? And that's on your best or on your worst day, you might have contractual responsibility. On your very worst day, you also are now on the hook for breaking the law for practicing the practice of engineering without a license. That's not going to happen every time that you're asked to discover defects, but as you can see by the statute, it casts a pretty wide net. So there's definitely a chance that observing construction for defects, right? And defects are going to be based on plans and specifications. So if you're evaluating the construction for plans and specifications, there's a chance you could be performing the practice of engineering and you don't even know it. And it actually happens all the time, and people aren't always caught. Thank God there aren't always issues. But when there are, that's when you run into pretty big problems. So one example of that is Duncan versus the Missouri Board for Architects. What this case really should scream to engineers is that design professionals shouldn't seal it if they aren't willing to stand by it. In this case, a steel fabricator was working on the construction of a hotel, and there were issues with some of the steel connectors. The steel connectors actually led to the complete collapse of a floor of the hotel. When the floor fell through, 114 people died, over 200 people were injured. So just because of these steel connectors, Granted, there were other things that may have contributed, but overall, in court, what was determined to be the ultimate cause were these steel connectors. The engineer of record obviously pointed fingers at the steel fabricator and vice versa. That's what you do when something like that goes wrong. And it's unfortunate, but it's true. The engineer argued that it was entitled to rely on the steel fabricator's work. And in arguing that, the engineer was referring to when he received the steel fabricator's work, all he did was stamp it. He didn't review it closely. He just stamped it and sealed it as the state and the contract required. The steel fabricator argued the opposite and said, look, I was designing based on plans and specifications. Anything with, calculating live loads and the connections needed to do that, that falls to the engineer. The engineer stood by his point and said, no, I'm not responsible for this. I delegated this aspect of the design to the steel fabricator, and the steel fabricator assumed responsibility for that element of the design. And the steel fabricator actually had in-house engineers and architects. Their level of involvement isn't totally clear, but it's worth noting that there were design professionals involved. And still, the court disagreed with the engineer's opinion. So this is a win for contractors. A win at a great cost because a lot of lives were lost. But the court did determine that the steel connections under statute were an engineer's responsibility. So the important thing with that is to note that this case turned on state statute. If the statute had said something different or allowed certain delegations, similar to what we see in New York, where ancillary services can be performed by contractors, who knows how this case would have turned out. So that really stresses the importance of this statute. And what does this mean for contractors? Because if you end up in court someday, the fate of your company could potentially rely on how a court interprets this statute, because that could determine your responsibility for something like the steel connectors used in Duncan. And so when you look at language that, like the last clause up on the slide here, including consultation, investigation, evaluation, planning, et cetera, again, wide net, a lot of things could be included and could really drag contractors into a situation where the outcome is not so contract favorable as it was in Duncan. So just understand that your state and jurisdiction licensing statute is going to play a really big role in the amount of risk and liability that you're going to see with design delegation. So kind of leading into the pros and cons of design delegation, we're starting to see some of the risk. So design delegation is often discussed in terms of its complexity, but also in terms of its cost savings and efficiency, and minimizing design changes. Cost savings and efficiency can really come heavy and be recognized on projects where there are very complex and large systems involved. And one of the most often cited benefits is the combination of cost savings and efficiency, leading to a generally smoother construction process when design delegation is involved. Things like engineered systems for curtain walls, sprinkler systems, and elevators. Those things are often designed by specialty contractors and companies that have, I think I mentioned this, proprietary means of install and design. So the benefit of using somebody who already has their wheel up and running is huge when you think about the time and cost that it saves versus the owner and the owner's architect sitting down and designing that stuff from the ground up. It just doesn't make sense when you have somebody who already knows how to do it all. It also minimizes design changes. Of course, constructability issues often lead to design changes, NDCs, FDCs, things that the parties just don't plan for. And when these constructability issues are addressed up front by simply delegating the design to the person who's going to be constructing it, there's a lot of benefits in that because you already know that your constructability issues are being minimized on the front end. So just by involving these specialty trades early on, less changes are likely later on in the process. And so that means, you can bid for them. You can plan time for them because these kind of constructability issues are not just inconvenient because there's more work to be done. I mean, there are so many strings attached to that. liquidated damages, delayed damages, and all things associated with that. So all of that gets minimized to some extent by design delegation when done properly. Some cons of design delegation: there is a very large void in terms of consensus and certainty on the scope of services that should be involved in design assist. Because there's that void in our contract documents, the contract documents are very, very general. And I mean, that could be arguably true for all form contracts. With design delegation, though, there's a very acute risk of liability, which these first and second points go hand in hand, really. The risk of inadvertent assumption of liability for contractors. I would argue strongly, that's the biggest con of design delegation. When not done properly, it can be absolutely crippling to contractors. If scope is not given to you by an industry standard, it leaves it up to the contracting parties to define it meticulously as they go. And if you're not on the lookout for this up front, it's something that could definitely bite you later on. So kind of along with those cons, the risks of design delegation. And we kind of just addressed these a little bit, but there are definitely more to talk about. One of them is insurance coverage and professional services exclusions. Again, if your scope isn't defined and some design gets delegated to you, if your scope isn't defined, there's a good chance you could end up performing what the state would consider to be professional services. And if defects do pop up as a result of those services that you performed that ended up being professional services, then a lot of insurance policies that contractors sign up for have exclusions specifically denying coverage for any liability that results from the performance of a professional service. So there's a chance your insurance could not support you when you end up in a situation where you have liability because of design that was delegated to you. So you want to be very careful with your insurance coverage and make sure that what you're doing lines up with your insurance coverage. I would say, a lot of the time it's not going to be an issue, right? And your insurance is going to kick in when you need it to kick in. At least that's the thought, that's the hope. But when it is an issue with design delegation, because there are so many complex systems involved that usually get delegated, it can be very expensive to cover on your own if insurance doesn't cover it. Again, I talked about this a little bit, but lack of clarity is very common. And the whole idea that the standard form contracts that many people operate off of are AIA, right? They're architect favoring in some instances, and I guess that could be said for all contracts. But the reality is that the AIA does limit an architect's scope of review. So that then forces contractors to maybe step up and cover that scope. And that's, maybe known as a scope gap or a scope overlap, depending on how you look at that. But either way, some argue that this does create a black hole of responsibility and liability for the design. If nobody is signed up to cover for this, then who knows whose fault it's going to be if something goes wrong. Next, we talked about disclaimers and defects, but I like to call them sneaky delegations because they're not usually written out as a design delegation. Instead, responsibility will just be given to the contractor to discover defects. But think about that. What are the implications of that? If you are requiring contractors to report defects that the contractor knew or should have known of, you're essentially delegating some part of the design to the contractor. So this provision, again, back to what are those engineers trying to do? This is from the Engineers Joint Contract Documents Committee. And again, it just requires contractors to report defects it should have known of after inspections. And when you think back to the Colorado statute, what did it say, right? That inspections can be a part of a professional service. So you can see how this could sort of morph itself into a design delegation without even being aware of it. And when you're not aware of it and you have one of these sneaky delegations, you might not put in the time that you would if you were aware that this was your responsibility, and you probably won't have insurance coverage to back you up if something goes wrong. Another risk that you see outside of the design delegation context as well is a heightened standard of care. I want to bring this up with design or with delegated design, even though it spans much more broad than that, because a heightened standard of care can definitely be an issue when responsibility is getting tossed around. And that's exactly what's happening with delegated design. So be aware if you are being asked to perform your services at a heightened standard of care, because all this does is open up your arms for more liability, which I don't think anyone is trying to sign up to do. So like I said, heightened standard of care equals increased liability. That's almost always going to be the case. The general standard of care, most common, is the degree of care and skill usually exercised by members of the profession. A heightened standard of care is typically going to be maybe performance-oriented. I'm sorry, that should say outcome-oriented, results-oriented, yeah. So look for results-oriented standard of care, something, perfectly functioning or even just very high-functioning design, something that's free of defects. That's not realistic to expect of a design, build, construction project. That's not part of it. That's not what when you put your risk contingencies in your bid and you calculate those in, you're not expecting a perfect project. That's why contingencies exist in bids. But sometimes standards of care will call for a performance that is based on the results. They want something perfect. And even if you were to perform your services at a perfect level standard of care, just the ordinary, and you're hitting all your marks, hitting all your checks, whatever, it still might not be enough to reach these expectations for results that are just unrealistic. So some sample heightened standard of care language. Look for anything that places your standard of care above average or equates it to the best. Subcontractor represents that its services will be performed in a manner consistent with the highest standards of care, as opposed to the care and skill usually exercised by members of the profession. Here you see the highest standards of care, diligence, and skill. This can all create more risk for contractors when pieces of the design are delegated to them. So, risk mitigation. This is obviously one of the points maybe of more interest. What do you do, right? Like design delegation clearly opens up a world of hurt if you don't handle it right. So what do you do? Well, first, just to review some of the common liability traps: undefined scope, those sneaky delegations, scope overlap, unclear standard of care expectations, and maybe some lack of coordination that contributes to all of the above. So now we're kind of looking my slide blipped out for a second, but it looks like it's back up. So an example of the impact of undefined scope: here's what you need to mitigate, and here's what you should be on the lookout for. Scope directly impacts the liability that you're assuming. So the best way to mitigate liability when it comes to design delegation is to clearly define your scope. Leave no stone unturned. Figure out what you're going to do, put it in your contract, and make it clear. Because as you'll see from the Structural Engineering Association of Colorado, they view liability as totally dependent on scope. Depending on the scope of services, the engineer may choose to designate responsibility of designing precast concrete, primary structural systems, structural elements, or both to a precaster. This is specific to precast concrete, but the very first clause, depending on the scope of services. If your scope is not clearly defined, your liability cannot be either. So it is very important that you define your scope clearly. So that leads us then to, again, what I have dubbed the 3 C's of design delegation: risk mitigation. First of all, create a strong contract. Again, expressly delegate certain elements of the design. Figure out what your scope is and put it in your contract. If you're going to start with AIA general conditions, fine, but make sure you make it applicable and tailor it to your specific contract. Because again, if you don't and you ride the wave of the general contract provisions, there's probably going to be a scope gap or a scope overlap. In those situations, there's a chance you could be on the hook for this stuff. So one way to do that, to clearly define your scope, is include a scope letter. So whatever your contract says, great, try and make it as specific as possible. Beyond that, in addition to that, a scope letter is basically a letter from a subcontractor to a contractor dedicated to scope clarification. Clearly lay out the scope of work that you are responsible for as you see it. And at best, this is going to give you something to punt to if fingers start getting pointed when something goes wrong. You need to define this stuff straight out of the gate. The other thing that a scope letter could do is, if you include what you understand the design professional's scope of work to be, then that could also help highlight some areas where maybe your ship's in the night and you're not quite communicating as much as you need to. And it'll highlight areas where you need some clarity. I would highly recommend a scope letter. Either way, whether it highlights, areas where you need clarity, whether it affirms what your contract already says, or whether it gives you something to punt to when things go wrong, a scope letter cannot hurt you. So it's definitely something I would encourage. And kind of along with that, avoid scope overlap and scope gap, where more than one person or nobody is on the hook for a design element. That means there's a chance it could be you. Again, if you're thinking about what could go wrong, if nobody is on the hook from that right from jump, it could be you. So try and avoid scope gaps and scope overlaps, just at all costs, really. For your standard of care, the next C, care, which standard of, the standard of care, specify the applicable standard of care, specify which party bears responsibility for professional services, and for the professional standard of care. Because if you sign up to perform a professional service, are you going to be on the hook for not meeting that professional standard of care, in addition to breaking the law and engaging in the unauthorized practice of engineering? So it's definitely something to think about and something to be very clear about what your standard of care is. And do not subject yourself to higher standards of care with regard to the delegated portions of the design. Finally, coordination is key. Coordination among whoever's preparing your drawings and specifications, the other project participants that are going to need to rely on those, and the people who the design is being delegated to, owners, you want to think about timelines, all of that. Coordination is key, because if you think back to that case, Duncan versus Missouri Board of Architects, if they had just coordinated a little bit better, if they had just talked about, oh, okay, so steel, I'm your steel fabricator, does this include steel connectors? It was one conversation that didn't happen that led to 114 people dying, and liability that was up in the air in that case happened to land with the engineer. But coordination is key and can avoid, at a very minimal cost, both time and money, it can avoid those huge battles that design delegation can lead to. So strong coordination is huge. Also, in that coordination bucket, note the permitting requirements for the design. A lot of states and a lot of jurisdictions, this will be jurisdiction based, a lot of jurisdictions will require a permit before certain things can happen on the design. A lot of those on the construction projects. A lot of those permits will require the seal of an engineer. If that's the case, how much time do you need to develop that design before the engineer can then seal it and have time to review it and then go get the permit using that design? All of those things need to be thought through as designs are being delegated. Finally, know your state's licensure laws. And this kind of goes back to our scope issue. If you are not allowed to perform a service ancillary to the delegated portion of the design that involves a professional service, you need to know when to bring on a design professional and when it's maybe okay for you to do. And that is going to be highly fact dependent. I'm not getting into specifics on that for a reason, because it really is just going to depend on a case by case basis. But know what you're dealing with in terms of your state's licensure laws, because that could really end up being a large part of, or a big determiner of liability on the opposite end. So that is all I have for design delegation today. Are there any questions? Okay, so here's a question. We don't know what the final design will be. Okay, the question is, when we bid a project, we don't know what the final design will be, so we have to make an educated guess on size and gauge of studs. Besides including a not to exceed max stud size and gauge, is there a language we can use in our proposals to protect subcontractors when it comes to delegated design? Yes, definitely. A lot of standard form contracts will actually have provisions in them. I'm trying to see if I have one pulled up. Oops. But it doesn't look like I do. But a lot of standard form contracts will have provisions in them that disclaim a subcontractor's responsibility for performing professional services. So in a design build project, like we said, the design is not going to be complete right away. Maybe you're relying on 30%, who knows? But at that phase, the best you can do is disclaim liability for performing professional services. As the project goes on, it's going to be very important to communicate with the design professional and whoever else you're working with to make sure that what you're doing does not include those professional services. And then if you include that language, disclaiming that responsibility in the very beginning, you can point to that later on as the project develops. The level of specificity that's going to be appropriate right up front really is going to depend on so many different things in the project. But a lot of those standard form sources will have some good starter language that can be tailored and tweaked to kind of use in your contract. Yes, of course. Okay, well, I was very happy to join you all today. If there are any questions later on that pop up after this, feel free to reach out. Again, a lot of this stuff is very fact dependent, so I might be able to give more information or more guidance, on a case-by-case basis. But either way, I hope this was helpful, and I hope everybody has a great day. So thank you.